Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to do another swatching review, and this time it's going to be on the Morphe 35T palette, which is just full of beautiful kind of neutral plummy tones. There's also some bronze, some golds, and also some kind of olive green khaki shades in this palette. I'm going to be doing swatches of all 35 eyeshadows in this palette and kind of give you an idea of what the texture and finish of each of the shades. So we're just going to start off with the top row, and I'm going to move from kind of right to left. So the first shade in this palette looks to be a kind of quite cool tone, taupey, transitional type shade. And this one you can see is definitely a matte finish. This kind of colour reminds me of, if you know Mac's Quarry or something like Makeup Geek's Unexpected, which is a kind of very cool but neutral mid-tone taupe shade. So the second shade along is definitely more of a metallic shade, and for me this looks like it's got hints of like pink. The payoff is beautiful, and although this is a taupe shade, there's a definite pinky mauvey undertone to it. It's a really pretty shade. Moving on to the third shade along, this one looks to be a bit more of a satin finish. There's less of that kind of metallic sheen to it, and this one is more of a kind of a bit slightly darker than your skin tone shade, but there's a bit of pink to it as well. It's a satin finish and there's not too much of a strong sheen. You can actually use this as a transition colour and it would work nice as a subtle contour in your crease. Okay, moving on to the fourth shade along, and we're back to the metallic eyeshadows. This one is definitely more of a darker shade. It's more like a cool tone bronze. It's a lot deeper and the pigment is just incredible. One swipe and you've got pigment for days. Okay, moving on to the fifth shade, and this looks slightly less metallic than the previous shade. This is a pinch darker than the previous shade, so it looks like we're going from kind of light at one end to the darker shade at the very end. I feel like this is a tad less metallic. That's the difference between this shade and the last shade, and this has a bit more of a warmer undertone. There's certainly a little bit of a red hint to it. Okay, then moving on to the final shade of the first row. This shade is also in a similar vein as the two previous shade, but I'd say this has definitely got more of a kind of mauvey undertone, so a tad more perhaps cooler than the previous shade, but this one has definitely got a much more stronger metallic sheen to it. Okay, let's move on to the second row, and we're going to start off with the kind of far right. Again, the first shade in the second row is, I'd say, another very nice transitional shade. It's a matte finish, of course. It's definitely more of a light brown. It reminds me of MAC Wedge or Makeup Geek Latte perhaps. Although it's a light brown, it's more of a cool tone light brown. There's not a lot of warmth in it. Okay, then moving on to the second shade of the second row, and this looks to be a slight satin finish. There's a definitely slight, ever so slight amount of sheen there. It's a tad deeper in tone and definitely a bit more warmer. It's more of a camel tan shade as opposed to the previous shade that was a little bit more on the cooler, neutral, slightly taupe side of brown. And although it's a satin shade, the sheen is just not really picking up when it's on the skin at all. So you can certainly wear it as a transition shade without being scared that there might be too much shimmer or shine. But I'm pretty sure that is a kind of satin finish because there was definitely a slight sheen top coat, although as I've swatched it I feel like the sheen is not that kind of prominent anymore. Okay, then we're moving on to the third. This is a little bit more kind of slightly more earthy than the previous shade. There's less of a kind of plum mauve undertone. This is a bit more kind of on the brown, dark golden side. It's got a really nice kind of sheen without being shimmery. The fourth shade definitely has a bit more of a mustardy, slight olive colour to it. Again, it's a metallic shade, but I do detect hints of like sparkle in there. It's a gold, but it's not like a true vibrant gold. It's more of a slightly muted down, dirty gold, I would call it. So moving along, again, we've got the colour that's very similar to the last, and this looks slightly more deeper in tone. Yes, this is more of a dark gold and a slightly more truer gold than the last one. It doesn't have that hint of olive and mustard to it. So the next shade along is more of a kind of a satin finish, but I could definitely see gold flecks in there. The gold flecks in it might sound scary, but it's very, very, very subtle. You can barely notice it. I mean, you have to really be up close and personal to actually notice that there are gold flecks in it. It's quite a dark, sandy brown shade, although it's quite a mid-tone brown. So this could work really well in the crease if you just want to get that bit more definition. Right, moving on to the final shade of this second row, and this definitely has a bit more of an olive green undertone. It's a metallic finish, but not as strong as some of the metallic shades that I have already swatched. It's a very kind of muted, subdued kind of dark gold. It's got that slightly grungy look about it. Moving on to the third row, and this shadow looks very exciting in the pan. It's kind of green, but there's a bit of red and brown in it. It reminds me of MAC Club, which I don't own, but I've seen. And what is that new, the new MAC, them sparkly finish eyeshadows, Boom Boom Room, that's it. It's that new glittery, shimmery, that's one of MAC's eyeshadow releases at the moment. And although this is probably the most out there eyeshadow in the palette, it's still very wearable. I mean, because it's got that brown and that reddy plum undertone, it's still very kind of earthy and neutral. Moving on to the second shade of the third row, this is definitely more on your purple side of things. It's got that metallicness to it, and when it catches the light, it actually reminds me of Makeup Geek Wisteria, which is one of their foiled eyeshadows. Okay, moving on to the third shade along. Again, it's a satin finish eyeshadow that you could easily use in a crease because the sheen is just not prominent. It's more of a pinky purple as opposed to kind of a lavender purple. Moving on to the next shade is also a satin finish. This is more of a kind of light brown, but there's a definitely warm pinky undertone to it, like almost like a dusty pink undertone to it. And it reminds me of MAC Hoax, which I love to wear as a transitional shade. Then moving on to the fifth shadow along in the third row, this looks to be another metallic shade. It's a dark, even dirtier gold, but there is a hint of kind of that khaki green in there. So it almost looks kind of like a mustardy gold. And moving on to the next shadow, this definitely has a lot more golden flecks than any other eyeshadow in this palette. This is more of a mid-tone neutral brown, and you can definitely see the golden flecks in it. So probably not one for the crease unless you like wearing glittery shades in the crease. That's not really my cup of tea. And moving on to the last colour in the third row, and this is more of a satin finish. This is definitely more of a khaki brown shade. Again, it looks like a matte shade when it's on the skin. The sheen is very, very subtle. If you're going for that more grungy, kind of more earthy type of look, then this is a really nice brown to have. Right, moving on to the fourth row, and we're going to kick off with a super vibrant metallic shade, and this is one of the favourite shades of the palette. This is an absolutely stunning shade. It is a very, very super metallic colour, and I would say it's a pink colour. It's pink, but it's a very kind of earthy pink. There is a kind of hint of dustiness to it that keeps it very neutral and grounded. It's very close to a rose gold, but it doesn't have that much gold in it. And moving on to the next shade, and this is what I would call more of a rose gold. It's a gold, but there's definitely a kind of pinky peach undertone to it. Moving on to the next shade from there, this appears to be, oh, I would say it's quite actually close to the previous shade, just a tad darker and a tad warmer, I would say. There's more of like a subtle orange hint to this shade. They don't look too dissimilar in the palette, but when you swatch you can definitely see the difference between the two. Then moving on to the fourth shade along, and this one appears to be a kind of rich brown metallic shade. Now this shadow reminds me of MAC Morphe. It's a very kind of dark bronzy brown shade. I'd say this is more on the neutral side of brown as opposed to kind of warm brown. And moving on to the fifth shade, it's pretty similar to that last shadow we just swatched, except for the fact that it's more of a flat satin finish. Again, the sheen doesn't really pick up. You can easily wear this colour in the crease. It's more of a cool tone brown. Now we're getting more on the kind of green side of things. And this is another metallic shade. And wow, that is another very unique shade, certainly unique in my collection. This is a kind of bronze with a bit of forest green thrown in there. I never wear green eyeshadows, but if I were to wear green eyeshadows, this is the sort of shade that I would opt for. It's still very much earthy because it's got that brown to it, but it's also got that nice bronzy sheen to it as well. So it's not green. Then the last eyeshadow from the fourth row, this is more of a blackened plum brown. This is definitely more of a kind of satin finish. It has a slight metallicness to it. This is just a nice way to smoke out any type of eye look instead of using like a dark flat brown or even a black. Moving on to the final row, finally. I think I'm getting a bit hot and sweaty now. So the first shade is a matte shade and it looks to be a very cool tone brown. I would call this a grey brown. It's not a true grey, but it's not a true brown. It's definitely something in the middle. Perfect if you're doing a cool tone smoky eye. The next shade along seems to be a matte grape purple, and this is, I'd say, a mid to dark tone purple shade. So again, great for kind of any sort of plum toned eye or pinky toned eye, and this would work really nice as a shade in the crease. And moving on to the next shade, also matte. This is definitely more of a chocolate brown, I think. Yeah, maybe a tad lighter. So it's a kind of mid to dark tone brown. Again, it's very kind of in between, not too cool, not too warm. Definitely more of a neutral tone brown, would work well in the crease. Also just a nice shade to kind of smoke out an everyday neutral eye look. Then moving on to the fourth shade, also another matte purple, but this is definitely a pinch darker and a tad cooler than that second shade we swatched on the bottom row. And then the fifth shade along in the bottom row, we are back to our metallic shades. This is actually more of a satin metallic. The metallic isn't very prominent in this colour, and this is more of a very dark earthy brown. Again, another shadow that has a few sparkly specks in the pan, but when you swatch it, it's not very prominent. I can't actually see it at all. In some lights it looks really dark, but in other lights you really see that kind of beautiful bronze sheen running through it. So the penultimate shade of the bottom row is a very kind of dark, kind of slate grey with a brown undertone. It's more of an ashy brown, I would say. Very nice dark colour. That is probably the darkest colour in the palette. And then the final one is also another interestingly unique eyeshadow, and this seems to have a lot more green to it. It's a metallic shade, almost like a duochrome effect. There's a slight reddish brown in it, but the teal green is definitely the stronger colour in this shade. So as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed, then I really hope you do. I'll see you in my next video. Bye!